Welcome to Sports Extra. I'm your host Ali Gohar. We've got two segments tonight, but the first one I think we can all guess. It has to be the death of the greatest footballer that's walked the earth, Diego Maradona. He was an absolute genius on the football pitch, but off the field, his life was marked by addiction and controversy. He was a flawed genius, and I can't think of many geniuses that weren't flawed. He was a larger-than-life character, even bigger than football. And I was just thinking about the impact Maradona had, not just on football, but worldwide. And I thought to myself, yes, you have celebrities, you have stars, you have superstars, but then you have Diego Maradona. The world has lost one of the greatest athletes we've ever seen. So to talk about Diego Maradona's career and his life in greater detail, I have two guests with me. In the studio, I have sports analyst Mr. Ali Mehdi. Ali, Assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum salam, Ali.
Great to have you on.
Likewise.
And on Skype, we've been joined by a senior sports analyst, Samira Kunti. Samira, great to have you.
Hi, nice to be on the show.
Thank you very much. I'll turn to Ali Mehdi first in the studio. Ali, I had a hard time trying to, before we came on the show, I was thinking about how I was going to introduce the segment, how I was going to talk about Maradona. But we don't really, have words. We don't have the vocabulary or the superlatives to sum up Diego Maradona and what he meant to football.
Look, Ali, it's been about 48 hours since he passed away, and I'm still dumbfounded and lost for words. This is somebody who didn't speak volumes in terms of football, in terms of sports, but he meant everything to people all around the world. He reverberated all over the world. You're not talking about football, you're talking about a celebrity status, you're talking about a person larger than life, a person in general. He meant everything to people in South America and people all around the world. You can go to anybody who's fond of any other sport and they would know the name Diego Maradona. Why? Because of the impact he left on the game, the impact he put on the pitch, and he left off the pitch. He was one of those people during the 80s and 90s when football actually, after the departure and after the retirement of Pele, there wasn't any larger than life superstar, but then came Diego Maradona. Diego Maradona dominated the 80s. Even in the early 90s, he was the sort of person which, if anybody knew about football, they knew about Diego Maradona. You can ask your parents, you can ask anybody in the streets, for he meant everything to everybody in Argentina, he meant to everything in South America, and it's because of him that the popularity of football has actually gone to another level.
Well, our PTV World production team has summed up Maradona's life and a career in this report. Let's listen in.
Widely regarded as one of the greatest players of all time, Maradona was one of the two joint winners of the FIFA Player of the 20th Century award. Maradona's vision, passing, ball control and dribbling skills were combined with a small stature which gave him a low center of gravity, allowing him to maneuver better than most other football players. He would often dribble past multiple opposing players on a run. His presence and leadership on the field had a great effect on his team's general performance, while he would often be singled out by the opposition. In addition to his creative abilities, he possessed an eye for goal and was known to be a free kick specialist. A precocious talent, Maradona was given the nickname the Golden Kid, a name that stuck with him throughout his career. In his international career with Argentina, he earned 91 caps and scored 34 goals. Maradona played in 4 FIFA World Cups, including the 1986 World Cup in Mexico, where he captained Argentina and led them to victory over West Germany in the final, and won the Golden Ball as the tournament's best player. In the 1986 World Cup quarter-final, he scored both goals in a 2-1 victory over England that entered football history for 2 different reasons. The first goal was an unpenalized handling foul known as the Hand of God, while the second goal followed a 66-yard dribble past 5 England players, and it was voted Goal of the Century in 2002.
Maradona gives Argentina the lead. The England players protesting to the referee.
In his club career, Maradona played 490 games and scored 259 goals. Maradona was transferred to Barcelona in Spain for a world record fee of £5 million. In 1983, under coach Cesar Luis Menotti, Barcelona and Maradona won the Copa del Rey, beating Real Madrid, and the Spanish Super Cup, beating Athletic Bilbao in 1983. Barcelona defeated Real Madrid on the road in one of the world's biggest club games, the El Clasico, a match where Maradona scored and became the first Barcelona player to be applauded by arch-rival Real Madrid fans. At Napoli, Maradona reached the peak of his career. He soon inherited the captain's armband and quickly became an adored star among the club fans. In his time there, he elevated the team to the most successful era in its history. Napoli won the first ever Serie A championship in 1987. Sports journalist David Goldblatt wrote, "The celebrations were tumultuous."
Napoli al primo posto, è stato colui che ha fatto rinascere Napoli, ha fatto gioire Napoli.
Quando tu parli con un bambino, puoi parlare con una persona che ha 90 anni.
The world was turned upside down. Maradona became the coach of Argentina's national football team in November 2008. He was in charge of the team at 2010 World Cup in South Africa before leaving at the end of the tournament. The former Barcelona and Napoli star had struggled with health problems in recent years and even went to a rehab. His career continued even despite him having a cocaine habit during his playing days. He was due to continue receiving treatment for alcohol dependency after a long history of drug and alcohol abuse. He was a god in Argentina, in Naples, and all around the world. He will be remembered as a genius of football.
Samira Kunti, who's joined us on Skype, a sports analyst. Samira, just thinking about Maradona and how it all started for him. He was noticed at a very young age, and he came from poverty, which made him even hungrier to perform, hungrier to succeed at the highest level. And just early on, what he managed to do was nothing short of remarkable. And the fact that and with all the problems that he had, I'm mainly talking about his drug addiction, because that started in 1982 at the peak of his career. He had already achieved so much. Just imagine if he didn't have these, if he didn't have addiction problems, how much better he could have been, and he's still regarded as the greatest of all time.
Yeah, absolutely. He started out from very humble beginnings. There's this iconic image of him playing in the mud near the shanty town where he was born and grew up. So those are very humble beginnings. But I think one of the things that is often overlooked with Maradona is the fact that he had an eagerness and a willingness, especially in the early years of his career, to go all the way to the top. So he did put in a lot of training work in those early days. Now, well, the question, would he have been even better without his off-field problems? It's hard to even just begin to imagine how much better he would have been. But I would like to stress that Maradona, before he arrived in Naples, was always a very player off the field as well. And that's often an aspect of his career that is forgotten.
Samira, I think it's safe to say that his piece de resistance was against England in the World Cup in 1986. First, when he literally pushed the ball into the goal, and later on he called it the hand of God, and that caught on. Even the Daily Mirror's headline when he died was, "Now he's in the hands of God." I thought that was beautiful. But then the second goal, I mean, it was sheer poetry. Nobody has ever been able to match a goal like that. I mean, when he went past, 7 defenders. That right there, that goal just summed up the genius and the artistry of Diego Maradona. Your thoughts?
Well, I think you have to see his second goal all together with his first goal as well, because those 2 goals happened in a span of 4 minutes. And now what does this game, this quarterfinal, England and Argentina, represent for Maradona and Argentina? It's that moment where they beat the old enemy. Because remember, the build-up to that quarterfinal, the backdrop to that quarterfinal, was the end of the Falkland Wars. But back in Argentina, resentment, because in the early 19th century, England and Argentina had a sort of colonial relationship wherein the English controlled Argentina's financial purse. And so that resentment was always there with the Argentinians. So what does Maradona do in that game? He lives out a collective fantasy of Argentina. He does not only beat England, but he shows them that he can outsmart them. That's the symbolism of the first goal. He tricks and outsmarts Peter Shilton. And then with the second goal, he shows, I can not only outsmart you, but I'm also better than you. So Maradona and Argentina live out that collective fantasy in the most unimaginable way possible in that quarterfinal. And now the second important thing to understand from this game is they defeat England, they move on to the semi-finals, and in the end, Maradona will captain his team to the world title against Germany. Argentina is probably the most significant game in Maradona's life because what it does, and this may sound as a contradiction, it destroys his life. Because from that moment on, back home, he becomes God. And clearly, no one is built to be God. And Maradona was a person least of all built to be God.
That's very well put. Ali Mehdi, look, and I think Mr. Kunti summed it up well, that what Argentina, when Maradona was at his prime, Argentina as a country was going through a lot. They were dogged by violence, poverty, dictatorship. So they were in desperate need of heroes. And they looked to Maradona. And Maradona just represented something very, very special for them. So he had a heavy burden to carry. So in a way, I can understand an absolute artist, genius on the football field, but off the field, why he got into trouble a lot, why he became a drug addict and an alcoholic, and he got drawn into bad company, especially when he was in Italy playing for Napoli. I can understand why someone like that would fall into that trap.
Well, you have to look at the history of Diego Maradona. You look at his bio. Basically, when growing up, he actually started, look, he was with a family of 6 people. I mean, he had about 7 people. He had 5 sisters and he had 2 parents which he had to support. His father was a manual worker and they didn't have much, didn't have much of an income. So, but the thing with Diego Maradona is he started supporting his family from the age of 15 when he played for, the Argentine juniors. And then going forward, he always had this burden. He was such a talented, skillful player that he was always in the limelight. Now, when he was always in the limelight, he didn't know how to deal with it. He wasn't protected or anything. I mean, he was very shy at the beginning, but then he started to flaunt himself. But, going forward, there was this huge burden on him because he was the first real superstar for Argentina. And going into that he believes he should have played that 78 World Cup, but he was too young. He couldn't play. 82 World Cup for Argentina, he played well until they got hammered against Brazil. And then when he came to 86, that 86 World Cup actually summed his whole life. He summed up, probably the 20th century, because there was Argentina, as you mentioned, poverty hit, war-stricken. Previously in 1982, they were actually dealt with a huge blow in the Falklands War when they actually lost, territory to Great Britain. So going into that match against England, there was an extra spice to that game. There was an extra motive, and Diego Maradona's sole mission was to beat them and actually progress further. I mean, and probably the 2 best matches he ever played was, yes, that match against England and against Belgium in the semi-final. But that final, it was probably, I feel that not only 86 World Cup was the best World Cup of all time, but in that final, it was a really good final. I mean, it was a final which, the favorites were Argentina, but you could never count out the Germans. Argentina raced to a 2-0
But they weren't the favorites in that World Cup, and that's what I want to pick up on. When you talk of all the great players of the past, like Pele, Maradona, Zinedine Zidane, today you have Lionel Messi and Cristiano Ronaldo, why many would rate Maradona as the best? Because he actually played with played with weaker teams. Argentina were not the favorites in 1986, Samira Kunti. They were definitely not the favorites. Napoli were, not rated very highly. And when he was there, they won 2 Serie A's. I mean, that's one of the reasons why he's rated as the greatest footballer that's ever walked the earth.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's also this element of people relate more to him. There was obviously that element of suffering that we have been speaking of, but there is also that element that he was a sort of an underdog. Because remember his time at Barcelona when he first moved across the Atlantic, in which was at the time a world record transfer fee. His time at Barcelona didn't go all that well for various reasons. He fell out with the club president, he fell out with the media, with the local fans. There were rumors that he was bankrupt. And so he moved to Napoli. And that move was a little bit surprising because Napoli at the time hadn't won anything. They weren't a big club. But look, he goes to Napoli, he plays fantastic. A couple of fantastic seasons. He wins the Scudetto twice with Napoli. And what that does, or what that represents, is that the poor South wins over the rich northern Italian clubs, the likes of AC Milan and Juventus. And it's the same sort of scenario at the World Cup in '86, where he's surrounded by mere mortals in his team, whereas remember Pele, those teams had a number of players that were absolutely brilliant. So I always think that at Naples and Argentina, there was also that underdog element which made Maradona so relatable.
Tributes have been pouring in from around the world for Diego Maradona, but the best one, Ali Mehdi, was from Pele, saying that one day I hope we can play football in the sky. That for me right there sums everything up. That just represents what Maradona meant to everybody.
I mean, the sort of mutual respect he had amongst the greats, the greatest of all time, the likes of Pele, and all the superstars of today. You're not only talking about superstars in terms of football, other sportsmen all around the world. You talk about Sachin Tendulkar, Virat Kohli, Brian Lara actually had a tribute towards him. He said that, growing up, I actually...
In the India-Australia match today, the commentators for a good 15 minutes, Shane Warne, Mark Warne, all of they were talking about Diego Maradona.
They were talking about him, and then obviously all the football matches which took place in Europe this week, in the Champions League and the Europa League, they all had a minute's silence for Diego Maradona. So he meant so much, not only to football, to all sports around the world. I mean, he reached a level which probably will never ever be reached. You can talk about the likes of the Cristiano Ronaldo, the Lionel Messi. These are great players. But who started off? It was Diego Maradona. Diego Maradona, his rise was incredible, but also his downfall was unfortunate after that 1990 World Cup, where he actually beat Italy in this Sao Paulo, when he beat them in this Naples. That was actually started his downfall, and then he got into all sorts of controversies. Otherwise, he had on the field, he was probably, he was unmatched.
And I think in an interview, he said, just imagine if I wasn't a drug addict, I could have been even better. And that's a scary thought. I mean, he achieved all that being a drug addict. It's just incredible. It just shows what a genius he was. Samira Kunti, I'm interested to know, and I asked this question earlier. Where would how Maradona for you? I mean, is there anybody that comes close to him? Maybe Pele, Zidane. Today we've got Cristiano Ronaldo and Messi. Or was Maradona just something else? Was he in a league of his own?
Well, that's always the million-dollar question, isn't it? Let me just explain here that I was born in 1988, so I never really got to see Maradona in his prime or otherwise. I did see him as a coach of Argentina when he debuted in 2009 in Glasgow in Scotland. I went to Glasgow. I saw him at the World Cup 2010 as well in South Africa. Against Germany, the 4-0 elimination. So I have memories of him as a coach. But I think what his departure, his passing signifies, at least from my understanding, is that it represents for generations of fans and people around the world a part of themselves, childhood memories have gone, and an essential part of the game is gone as well. I personally, I don't think it's the right time to discuss who was the greatest player of all time. What I will say about the Maradona, Pele, and Messi comparison, because those are generally considered as the top three players in the world, is the interesting thing about this is that how different they are as personalities. Now, you can argue about all their achievements on the field, but as personalities, they were so different. As I mentioned earlier, Maradona was catapulted into this godlike figure after 1986, and he couldn't deal with it. And the reason for that is, and that's what I find so fascinating, is because Maradona, Diego, he didn't want to be God. He didn't want to be Maradona. Diego wanted to be Diego. And that's what sets him apart from both Pele and Messi, because Edson Arantes loves to be Pele. And with Lionel Messi, he's such an even-keeled person that none of us really know who Lionel Messi really is. So what I would finally like to say perhaps is that Maradona was not a saint, but that's perhaps to miss the point. He was a gloriously authentic person, Diego being Diego, and that makes him, I think, the most compelling football player of all time. And that's a wonderful, captivating, and haunting legacy to have.
I think, Samira Kunti, you said something very beautiful. I think it's touched me when you said I don't want to compare, maybe it's not the right time, but he was probably the most compelling player of all time. And I'll give Ali Mehdi the last word here, because when you talk about greatness and skill on the football field, I mean, you're really splitting hairs here. Who was better, Pele, Maradona, Messi, whoever. But then, you have to look past that, because you can't really decide just based on pure skill, because they were all great. You have to then go to flair, panache. Who had the bigger impact? Who was more relatable to the masses? Why are they so revered? And when you look at it from that lens, you can't go past Diego Maradona.
You can't go past that lens, because at that period, in that era, it was all about Diego Maradona. I think it's very difficult to actually compare footballers of different eras, but that era we know for a fact that he was actually the most dominant player. He was the biggest football superstar. He was the biggest sportsman in the world at that time in the 80s, along with the Mike Tysons, of the world too. So he summed everything up about the 80s and about the 90s too. The downside to it was actually his downfall, is that when he actually left Napoli after what he did for them, is that he wasn't given that perfect send-off, and that actually hurt him towards, the later part of his career. And he never actually was the same player after that. But that golden period in the 80s, I mean, probably will never see a footballer who was so compelling and as complete as he was at that period.
Samira Kunti, I'll give you the final word. Do you think he would be as, I know this sounds strange, because I mean, we shouldn't be promoting controversy or drug addiction like that. I'm not trying to suggest that, but do you think he would have been as revered if he didn't have that controversial side to him?
No, absolutely not. He would not be as revered as he is now. And the reason is quite simple. And you see it in Brazil as well. Pele is not as revered as Garrincha, for example, was. Garrincha, who passed away after alcohol abuse in the early 80s. But I think he is so revered, not just in Argentina, where he's God, and not just around the world, where he's an international icon, because he is a metaphor, or he was a metaphor for the human condition.
Beautifully said. We're going to leave it at that for this segment. Samira Kunti, thank you very much for joining us. Ali Mehdi, always a pleasure talking football with you, and it was a pleasure talking about Diego Maradona. This day had to come at some point. We were expecting it because of the health issues that he had. But just talking about the life of this great man and everything that he achieved, it just goes to show what he meant.